welcome to the Group 2 Cooperative Project. The members of this group are Janine Freeman, Denise Gallegos, Gustavo Garza, and Mariela Trevino. This project was a compare and contrast between the ADDIE approach and the Assure approach. There are many different instructional design models that are available for instructors to use. It is important when choosing a model to analyze the model and make sure it is the best fit for the instruction you are trying to give. Our group will be analyzing the Assure instructional design model and how it compares to the ADDIE instructional design model. We will go over each model by reviewing how it can be effectively implemented to the instruction and highlight the strengths and weaknesses. Let's start with the Assure model. The Assure model has 6 different phases. The first phase is the Analyze Learner Characteristics. The second phase is to state the objectives. The third phase is to select, modify, or design materials. The fourth phase is to utilize the materials. The fifth phase is to require learner response. And the final phase is the evaluation phase. In the first phase of analyzing learner characteristics, it is important to identify the general characteristics, entry competencies, learning styles, and the motivational and physiological factors of the learners. This is where we decide what the learners need. It is important to know what the learners already know on the subject and what they need to learn about. Without a needs assessment, it is hard for the instructor to know where to start with the instruction. In our lesson, this would be shown as the 22 third grade students, 12 of which are boys and 10 are girls. Their learning styles vary from auditory to visual and kinetic. Students have a high motivation for learning, and this class seems to get a little distracted with hands-on manipulatives. The next phase is to state the instructional goals or objectives. Any good instructional design requires goals or objectives. Stating these goals gives the instructor guidance as to what the learners need to accomplish after the learning occurs. It is important to identify the behavior to be demonstrated, the condition under which the behavior will be observed, the degree in which the learned skills are to be mastered, and it is important to classify your objective. In our lesson, our objectives are to classify common three-dimensional geometric objects including a cube, pyramid, sphere, cone, and cylinder. Also, to identify relevant properties including vertices, edges, and faces. And without assistance, third grade students will be able to identify the number of vertices, faces, and edges in a variety of three-dimensional shapes without errors. After you state the instructional goals, it's important to select the materials and the media as well as the method of delivery that will be used to deliver the instruction. In our lesson, we will need iPads with a Nearpod application, 1 Ziploc bag per student, 40 miniature marshmallows per student, and 50 toothpicks per student. The next step in the Assure model is to utilize these materials. Prepare the media and materials, practice the implementation of the lesson, prepare the environment, and prepare the equipment that will be used. In this step, the actual instruction is designed. It is determined how the media will be used to enhance the instruction as well as what will occur if the media fails to work. In our lesson plan, the students will need to log into Nearpod. Students will be given examples of 3D shapes, and new vocabulary will be introduced using the video in the Nearpod presentation. The next step is to require the learners to respond or to participate. The learners need to practice in order to accomplish the goals set for them. If they do not practice for themselves, the chances of them retaining this information are much smaller. It's important here that we describe how the learners will be involved in this lesson. And it's important to involve the students in active mental engagement and to provide feedback at this time before the actual assessment. For our lesson, students will work in groups of 4. Students will solve a riddle between each lesson. Students will be creating 3D shapes with toothpicks and marshmallows. The students will be given open-ended questions to answer as they are going through the lesson. Students will have opportunities to identify the vertices, faces, and edges by drawing pictures on the Nearpod lesson. The final stage is to evaluate. It is important here that we evaluate and assess the effectiveness of the lesson on the student learning. It is also important here that the learners have an opportunity to give feedback on the instruction. After looking over evaluations, the instructor will revise or edit the instruction based on the feedback. They may also have to reteach if the learners were not meeting the goals. In our lesson, we'll be using quizzes, student participation, verbal responses, and student feedback. Then it will be time for the instructor to revise the lesson based on these evaluations. Some strengths of the Assure model is that it incorporates media in its delivery process. It has an easy, logical structure, but is still influential. It is also learner-centered. Some weaknesses of this model are that it is limited to its purpose or use. It is mainly teacher-friendly or resourceful, and the analysis step in the Assure model, when referenced to the ADDIE model, can be seen as deficient. Now let's talk about the ADDIE model. There are 5 phases to the ADDIE model. The first phase is to analyze. The second phase is to design. The third phase is to develop. The fourth phase is to implement. And the fifth phase is to evaluate. In the first phase, you're analyzing. You are to identify the abilities, experiences, preferences, and motivation of the student audience. In this phase, the problem is determined. The learners are analyzed and the instructional goals are stated. This is similar to the first 2 steps of the Assure model. The major differences are that these 2 parts are combined into one phase and the possible constraints are considered here as well. In our lesson, we would show that we have 22 students, 12 of which are boys and 10 are girls. They are of a normal maturity level. They have been previously introduced to 3D shapes, but they can only identify the name of the shapes. There are 8 students in the class that are bilingual, and a constraint is that students tend to get distracted when working on hands-on activities. The next phase is the design phase. Here we identify the essential tasks that will be required to achieve an instructional goal. In this phase, the performance objectives are stated. A task inventory is also conducted to see what tasks need to be completed to reach each performance objective. This is similar to the stating of the goals section in the Assure model, but it goes into more detail of the different tasks used to complete these goals. In our lesson, our objective is, without teacher assistance, 3rd grade students will be able to identify the number of vertices, faces, and edges in a variety of 3-dimensional shapes without errors. Students will be using the iPads. They will log into the Nearpod lesson, and examples will be given of these shapes throughout the presentation. Students will create their own 3-dimensional shapes between each lesson using the marshmallows and the toothpicks provided. Students will be given an assessment through the Nearpod application. They will be put into groups of 5, and each group will share their final products with the class. The next phase is the develop phase. Here we identify the information to guide the student through the instruction. This can be compared to the select phase of the Assure model. In our lesson, materials will be set up, groups will be assigned, iPads will be fully charged and ready to go, and the lesson will be reviewed so it will promote effectiveness of the goals and objectives. The fourth phase is the implement phase. Here's where we identify and prepare teachers to facilitate the instructional strategies and the learning resources that have been newly developed. The content and learning materials are determined here. This can be compared to the select phase of the Assure model. In our lesson, the teacher will evaluate the students during the implementation based on his or her observations. The teacher will also be interacting with the students by asking questions to check for understanding along the way. The final phase is to evaluate. Here is where we identify perception, learning, and performance as the 3 main levels of evaluation associated with instructional design. Most models of instruction end with an evaluate phase. This is the same as the evaluate stage in the Assure model. Learners are assessed to see if they have met the objectives, and feedback is given by the learners so the instructor knows where changes need to be made. In our lesson, each lesson will be analyzed and evaluated. The teacher will review observations from the lessons, and the teacher will seek student feedback on how they perceived the lesson. After the evaluations are completed, the teacher will revise and edit, and reteach. Some strengths of the ADDIE model are that it is the most commonly used model. Other models are developed based on this model. It has flexibility and dynamics. It has a guidance structure for designing, and it can effortlessly be altered to fit any learning module. Some weaknesses are that it has a linear approach. It does not provide results in a timely or efficient manner. Although learners learn differently, there are instructional models that work best for both the teacher and the student. We have seen the comparison of two models in our project, the ADDIE and the ASSURE model. Both models are used to find a resolution to a common problem, how to get structure and meaning in order to educate the intended learner. We can make a case for either model in any situation. The great thing is, this gives instructors the ability to choose which model they prefer. Here are a list of our references. I hope you enjoyed.